Then I welcome you to this extra seminar of Phases and Traces of Violence, which is today on a Tuesday. Normally we have Thursdays. And but we are very happy to be able to have Andrea Peto here. Andrea Peto is Associate Professor at the Department of Gender Studies at the Central European University in Hungary. And she's the president of the Gender and Women's History section of the Hungarian Historical Association and of the Feminist section of the Hungarian Sociological Association. And she's co-president of @Gender, of which I think she gave us this folder. That is the European Association for Gender Research, Education and Documentation. Andrea's main research interests include European comparative social and gender history, gender and politics, women's movements, qualitative methods, oral history, and the Holocaust. And she is the author of several books and articles on European comparative social and gender history. I select 3 titles of her many publications. One is an earlier publication which is called Women in Hungarian Politics from 1945 to 1951, which is published at Columbia University Press in 2003. And she has also a book which is called Faces of Death, Visualizing History, which is co-authored with Klaartje Schrijvers from the Netherlands, and it's published at Edizioni Plus in 2009. And then very recently, together with Ildiko Varna, she published Political Justice in Budapest after World War II in 2012. It's published by Gondolat. Presently, she's working on gendered memory of World War II and political extremisms. And she was also awarded with the Officers' Cross Order of Merit of the Republic of Hungary in 2005 and the WWII Prize by the Hungarian Academy of Sciences in 2006. So we have a very famous person here. Today she will talk, or she will give the talk entitled "Recovering Visual Memory of Female Perpetrators After World War II: Risks and Challenges." So without further ado, give you the floor. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the interest. I truly appreciate that you came in this very unholy hour for this talk. So what I will be talking about is a part of my recent research. So yeah. So this will be approximately like 30-35 minutes with a small clip of 3 minutes, right? Just to make it possible to extend your interest span, right? So, in January 2007, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Archives received a donation of photographs with the inscription Auschwitz, 21st of June 1944, consisting of Karl Höcker's photographs of his service years in Auschwitz. In Höcker's Auschwitz album, there are no photographs of prisoners, unlike in the parallel Auschwitz album, I don't know, yeah, you see that, donated by Libby Jakob in 1983 to the Yad Vashem, which aimed to demonstrate the process, how inmates were handled there. The photographs of the Höcker album showed the female guards of Auschwitz enjoying themselves while on leave from duty. This series of photographs stimulated a new debate around how under-theorized the research on female perpetrators is. The surprise and uneasiness around the Höcker album was caused by the fact that the presence of women among the camp guards is one of the rarely discussed elements in historiography, and if it has been discussed, then the women are framed as beasts, not as normal, diligent, reliable workers who love to have fun when being off duty. This discussion spots a void in literature on political violence, namely female perpetrators. Recent research is trying to map the participation of women in every level of the Nazi state not only focusing on concentration camp guards, wives, but there is a representational deficit, namely that no woman is a part of the visual canon of Nazi Germany, but the beasts and the wives, the women of the Nazis, to quote this famous title, has got political consequences. So this paper analyzes this representational deficit. In an even more complex setting, the post-Second World War Hungary, which is yet to face the complicity and active participation of the Hungarian state in killing of its citizens. This deficit is even timelier to investigate, as Hungarian public life was shaken at the time of 2010 parliamentary elections, when 17% of the popular vote was won by a far-right party that shows continuity in terms of symbology and rhetoric with the right-wing extremist party of the pre-1945 period. So you see the very similar symbolism and also the guards. The picture of the right bottom was taken in October 1944, and the others are recent pictures. The latter, the Arrow Cross Party, you see the Arrow Cross, that's the Hungarian Nazi Party. The latter, the Arrow Cross Party, was in part responsible for Hungary's defeat in the Second World War and for the deaths of 500,000 of the country's Jewish citizens. The period that began with the political changes of 1989 and culminated in the victory of the right wing in 2010 election has seen a gradual questioning of earlier anti-fascist historical interpretation and the incipient rehabilitation of the pre-Second World War era. 1989, the collapse of communism reopened the public debate of anti-fascism. Therefore, history in Eastern Europe, a region occupied by the Soviet Army in 1945, has become an unfinished history. This paper, as a part of a larger work examining transitional justice in post-Second World War period from a feminist gender perspective, analyzes how this past, divided and unfinished in terms of the perpetrators, is shaped by and in return shapes to the visual representation. I examine the paradox that although photography and film were already well established in Hungary by the outbreak of the Second World War, very few photographs of the extreme right-wing women engaged in political activity during the war are to be found in the accessible public collections. Why are such pictures missing from the public collections and from newspaper reports on the political justice process after the Second World War? Why was there a failure to document female war criminals in a country in which only a few years earlier 4,600,000 Jews had been transported to concentration camps, mostly to Auschwitz, where 10 to 30% of the Hungarian women had given their support to the Arrow Cross Party. 10 to 30% of the women were members of the Arrow Cross Party. The Arrow Cross is more like the Salo in Italy, so this is not comparable to the fascist regime, for example, in Spain, but this is something which happened after the occupation of Hungary by the Germans. So why women who constituted 10% of the war criminals sentenced in the aftermath of the Second World War absent from photography? Why were, here are these questions, I hope, yeah. Why were the female executees erased from historical memory, even though Hungary, among all the countries formerly allied with Germany, carried out the highest number of female executions following the People's Court trials? Even where photos of the women do exist, they tend to be hidden away in uncatalogued archive boxes or inaccessible private collections. How did these photographs become forgotten pictures? What is the relationship between the failure to remember and Hungary's divided memory of the Second World War? And how is this relationship shaped by gender? How has this situation been altered by the internet and the publication of these formerly forgotten pictures, showing right-wing extremist women and female perpetrators by today's far-right websites. So, there are several reasons for the representational deficit in the collective memory as far as the female perpetrators are concerned. One reason has been shown in various works on political role of far-right women is the general invisibility of women in the far-right-wing extremist movements. A manifestation of this was that women activists in political lives were rarely photographed. Women were typically marginalized in politics, and in this respect, the extremist right-wing political parties were no exceptions. Examining the photographs I found, because I have to say I spent years digging different archives to come up with these photographs, we see secretaries or shorthand recorders. Yet there were in the Eurocross party several charismatic female leaders of whom there are no surviving photographs. Many women worked in the extreme right-wing parties both in peacetime and during the war. As other party apparatus, they tended to be employed in administrative positions. Here, I mean, this is the center administration of the Eurocross party in the 1930s, and then you see women who are like these normal secretaries. Yeah. The formality of party life is manifested in a group photo taken at the time of a visit to Kassa by Ferenc Szálasi, who is in the middle, the Eurocross leader. The Eurocross party seized power in Hungary on the 15th of October 1944, following Horthy's unsuccessful attempt to exit the war. At the time, the Red Army had already reached the country's eastern borders. The Eurocross rule was brutal and short-lived, lasting barely 6 months. So this is why I was using the metaphor of Saló, the Republic of Saló. The Republic of Sociale. If we look at a photo taken during the Eurocross Congress of the House of Loyalty, that is the main headquarters of the Eurocross party, we find among many of them 2 women. Who are the 2 rivaling women of leading the women's section, and they are seated very much apart. And this is a goldmine for historians because they were constantly sending denouncing letters to the party administration about each other, so we have got a huge file about this so-called cat fight between the 2 leaders of the women's section of the Eurocross party. But this is the only surviving photographs of these 2 women. I mean, their name is Mrs. Toma and Mrs. Ducsuan. This is more important than this. So, the uninformed women, and also here is another photograph. The uniformed women serve as an illustration in the life of the extremist right-wing party, and the attractiveness and photogenic appearance also plays a role in selecting female activists for public meetings. I would like to draw your attention to the Getty images sign. I will talk about this later on. Of course, wives were also present in the photographs. They embody the middle-class ideal, and they are portrayed as loyal supporters of their husbands who hold important positions in the party. This is an example of the wife of Kálmán Hubai, who was the leader of the Minister of Culture during these 8 months of the Eurocross rule. So, this is one reason, the general invisibility. The second reason for why few photographs had arrived in the 1940s was the era of iconoclasm. Although I examined many hundreds of files created by the People's Tribunals for the post-Second World War transitional justice institutions, I found not a single photograph. Photographs were not used as evidence. A crucial scene in Costa Gabra's film, The Music Box, when the music box starts to produce self-documentary images of the atrocities perpetrated by the Eurocross in Budapest. So this is the clip I wanted to show you, if the technology helps us. I don't know if you know this film by Costa Gavras. This is a film about the music box Right? This is holding the evidence. To show you. This is a film which was very much inspired by the recent cases of war criminals, and the story is that the daughter of the war criminal defends her father and denies till the last minute, till she recovers the music box with these photographs, that he actually participated in this massacres in Budapest. And of course, for a historian, that's a methodological question. If you are longing to have a music box like this, which consists of those photographs which are actually serving as an evidence for you. Anyway, but they are nowhere to be found because of the iconoclasm. So, and this also raises the question of the relationship between the tribunal and the photographs as evidence. The surviving photographs do not document the criminal acts as such, but instead they document the justice process. So we have got lots of photographs which are about the justice process. This supports the hypothesis that the people's tribunals played a key role in establishing the memory of the war. Even where a person did take a picture of an atrocity, he or she would normally destroy it out of fear of being held responsible. So the iconoclasm is the other reason. The third reason for the scarcity of photographs is the dominant anti-fascist discourse of the post-1945 period, which left no space for for the photographs, thus making it impossible to share the memories or to illustrate them. This is not an accident that the photos analyzed here have come from private collections and now are being used to document history as interpreted by the far-right website, which is called The Whisperer. So that's the major far-right website. The website's name reflects on its founder's perception of that true knowledge can only be whispered, as the dominant anti-fascist discourse silences true patriots. So the photos that we have analyzed established a special social time for these pictures, were not a part of the public discourse, and they were overseen during the post-Second World War period. The significance of the content of the photographs changed continuously, for it was only after 1989 and the advent of the internet that the Whisperer, the far-right website, made what had been family photos accessible for the public. And on the right, you see that here it says galleries, and there you can upload some of the photographs. So the photographs which I used, this one, this is a private photograph which actually surfaced on the far-right website, and also this one. So I'm one of the few researchers who is constantly looking for new photographs coming up at the far-right website. So I'm sure that I'm increasing the number of visitors on the site. Okay, so the other half of the excavated photographic sources relate to the participation of women in the people's tribunals. The portrait of Gisela Lutz, the wife of Szálasi, whose picture you have used for this excellent poster you have made, was made in the Andrássy 60 at the headquarters of the powerful Department of the State Protection. It would seem that the powerful head of the department made great effort to ensure that the interrogation of war criminals was documented. Thus, sources pertaining to this process are abundant. It was here at the Department of the State Protection, or Secret Police Headquarters, that during his interrogation, Szálasi, who was the head of the Eurocross party, put this handkerchief to the camera. And this had been embroidered by the female members of the Eurocross party, This illustrates the very contradictory relationship of the arrow across women's movement to female work. I actually argued that the embroidery was not necessarily the most important activity of the female members of the Arrow Cross Party. Still, when the leader of the Arrow Cross Party was taken to the court, he demonstrated that the women were very loyal to the organization, and then that's how we have got this picture of this masterpiece. Okay. Many photos of the People's Tribunals have survived. A significant number which was taken by private individuals. Based on the documentation, many women attended the trials. Many men were still being held as prisoners of war, while others were working. The documentation of crimes by means of official photographs helped the People's Court to reach their goal of seeing into citizens' consciousness what is good. For this reason, the Hungarian daily newspapers and newsreels carried an abundance of pictures of war criminals under prosecution, all of whom were male. A photograph of an exhumation of the site of the Maros Street is the only one to show a woman. Apparently, she had taken an active part in the murder of the patient of the Jewish hospital. As far as my research is concerned, the most interesting collection is held by the Police History Museum of Budapest. Not only do we receive a glimpse of the hot and stuffy atmosphere of the People's Tribunals, but also we get closer to the female perpetrators and they receive faces. The collection consists of photographs commissioned by the police to document the process of the trials. Here we return to the traditional documentary function of the photograph to document what actually has happened. The women brought before the People's Trial, whose trials were held in a university auditorium, like in this case, or who awaited for their fate while seated on a narrow bench of the accused, were unrecognized social actors, until the photos had been discovered by me. We do not know who took those photos, the crime reporter, a family member of one of the victims, or someone else. Evidently, the photographs found their way into the collection of the Police History Museum, and this way, these private photos became community photos, serving an illustration of the discourse on female war criminals. The most important picture, as far as this paper is concerned, I found in the photographic archives of the Hungarian National Museum among the photographs related to the People's Court. It is entitled Monci. If we manage to overcome our surprise that in the recent decades not one researcher bothered to change this sexist title, for my knowledge, none of the executed female war criminals were called Margit. Monci is a nickname, like Maggie for Margaret. We can then realize this picture as a metonym. This doesn't mean what it was in the past, but what it remains even today, a part of our everyday lives. In this way, we close the gap between the then and the now. If we interpret the picture in this manner, the photograph receives a presence, not a meaning. Its presence in the collection in a non-cataloged and marginalized way is the historical fact, not the meaning which is difficult to attribute to a picture about which you don't know anything but the title, which is Monci, right? Which is Margaret or Maggie. My purpose here is to present the current presence, existence of the past, and to reveal those points that are, in an unfinished and unprocessed manner, a part of our present reality. Although 7 women were executed as war criminals in Hungary, we have only this single photograph of a female execution. The photo seems to show one of these 7 women. We may think we know which one, but it is not the name, but the absence of the name that must be the subject of this research. And also it is very disturbing to look at this picture. Thus it is important to bear in mind Liebman's methodological consideration, which he referred to as double vision. Liebman also argues that when viewing a photograph of an execution, the researcher is both a witness of the event and a historian collecting qualitative material. The other methodological challenge is that if we know that history is written by victors, then we may also suppose that the victors are the ones photographing as a tool of dominating the narratives about the event. At the same time, this picture had been hidden in the miscellaneous box of the National Museum until I found it and decided to publish it. This will be on the cover of my book. So, we must ask ourselves, what will be the impact of publishing this picture? Will it help to make truth part of the consciousness by showing how these women that reported on Jews or stole Jewish property were subsequently punished, as this has been the major crime which brought women to justice? Concerning the analysis of visual sources, Perlmutter established the criteria on which basis such sources are established, accepted, and integrated. The function of a photograph is to present an event, and in doing so, it shapes popular memory. A great many official and private photographs were taken of war criminals, but only one of them, an undated photo, shows the execution of a woman. Looking at the old photograph is a part of processing, the Verarbeitung, of the past, and so that fact, the photo of Monty, Margaret, has remained invisible until now is important. According to Barth, a photograph has no meaning of itself, and it is only in dialogue with other sources that a meaning emerges. For this reason, we need to determine why the female perpetrators were forgotten. Were they forgotten because of the lack of a dialogue or because of the lack of a framework such a dialogue? We may also analyze the picture from an iconographical point of view. The photographer was facing the woman as she awaited her execution on the gallows, and executed corpse covered in a sheet lay alongside her. We see no other onlooker, which is unusual, as the executions were generally attended by a large number of people. The aim or task of the photographer was apparently to document the carrying out of this sentence. Foucault linked the notion of gaze and power, for disciplinary power also operates using visual means. A public execution is a means of this. At the same time, visual truth doesn't always accord with the truth of the justice system. For in this picture, we see a fragile woman in clean but modest clothing. She seems almost to be preparing for martyrdom. The various cultures of memory clash when it comes to interpreting this picture. Visual memory of the execution of war criminals in Hungary has portrayed them as martyrs, and the execution of Manzi, of this elderly woman, is no exception. This was not the case of the photographs depicting the men executed at Nuremberg. The iconography used in Hungary, however, undermines the anti-fascist discourse in which this execution took place. As early as in 1764, Cesare Beccaria argued that the execution is the state's weapon against uncooperative individuals. But if pictures of an executed person evoke feelings of sympathy and sorrow in viewers, then the execution has not fulfilled the disciplinary function anticipated by the state. On seeing the photo, many people will wonder why the woman's cardigan, I don't know how much you see that, yeah, the cardigan was the main concern of the man supervising the execution, given the fact that the woman would be dead within minutes. It is this human gesture that renders Manzi first and foremost a victim, whereby the crimes she committed were left to fade into oblivion. Not only is the female war criminal forgotten, but also the crime she has committed. In this way, the true victims become invisible in history. For researchers of this period, sites and modes of silencing are becoming historical fact itself, which should be analyzed while explaining the ways how gendered memory of the Second World War has been constructed. It was the new cultural history school and that in its methodology turned away from the idea of visual sources of history as documentations of reality and which focused on representation. Photographs may be analyzed not only as descriptive means for the documentation of historical truths, but also as visual discourses which are telling the story of the visual representation of right-wing extremist women. The photographs are determined by the absence. There are no pictures. If there are some, we do not know who took them and what they depict. Based on Carol Zamel's theoretical approach, the photos are emblems of the past. Unknown, forgotten, and absent photos belong just as much to the documentary function of the photographs as the emblematic function. So why did the producers of the photographs choose this kind of representational form if their goal was to preserve the subject of the photograph for collective memory? The question of what and who are chosen to be photographed receives a political relevance, as this is the process of building up an archive of the past for future generations to read and interpret. The photograph is mediating the past to us, therefore the framing of the photo and also the accessibility of the photo are crucial issues. The accessibility. The photographs published here were intended to be forgotten. No one thought that, by no means, that they would become iconic pictures. And this is my intervention into the whole process, and that's what I would like to problematize in this presentation. So what is the role and the responsibility of a feminist researcher digging up the archive and finding these photos? Historians have at their disposal not only written sources, but also from the mid-20th century onward, visual sources, the use of which requires a special methodology. According to Manovich, the distinct border between production and consumption have been blurred by the new media. This means that those who took the photograph of Szalasi's visit in Košice, that's the photo, if you remember, and preserved it for decades under difficult circumstances in private collection in communist Czechoslovakia, or those who published that after 15 years of communism, a group photograph, this one, the smiling arrow cross-party workers, they not only produced a picture, but, and this is the claim, also contributed to the creation of a new knowledge and a new memory politics. This is why the increasing number of far-right websites is so crucial to the memory boom after 1989, for they opened to a wider audience locations of memory that had been previously private and closed. So that's one of the importance of this website. Their aim, those who are running this website, was to emancipate their own history, to make it possible to tell and represent their history, which had not been an option before. So the two factors, the internet and the opening up after 1989. A photograph also signifies a memory space in which counter memories can be formed, for photographs represent a repeat socialization. We are likely to look at photographs more than once. As time passes, the memories associated with the photograph will change, but the location and the occasion of remembrance will be the viewing of the picture. This is possible in various visual narrative modes, whereby opportunities arise for injustice to be exposed from the perspective of the subjective historical actor. Photographs have no meaning in themselves, but they acquire meaning within a narrative of an interpretative framework. In 1945 and after 1989, similar changes occurred in the narrative frame. A space was created for the reinterpretation of the lives and deeds of those who were accused by the people's tribunals. The spaces communicate with each other, for when previously unknown, namely unpublished, photographs of the Arrow Cross members and supporters were published, they immediately find their way to the far-right websites. This is why I stress the need for a reverse process, whereby photos of the far-right movement that have been lurking in private collections and whose owners have been uploaded them to this website should find their place in the mainstream of historical criticism, thereby establishing a much-needed dialogue on our evaluation of the past. This is actually an important claim, because there are several historians who are actually saying that we should not, as professional historians, get engaged with this kind of revisionist history writing. I'm representing a different position, and I'm very happy to discuss this with you. When analyzing photographs, we should take 4 criteria into consideration: the material of the photo, the selection, the provisionality, and the authenticity. So the materiality, the selection, the provisionality, and the authenticity. Concerning the material of the photograph, the pictures showing the Arrow Cross women are preserved as prints, the paper form, in the museum. In the collection of the Hungarian news agency, the negatives, the originals, are also present, as the photographs are stills captured from the newsreels, or the roll of the film came directly from the photographer. Aware of the historical trend, the Life magazine, the American Life magazine, hired a photographer to produce pictures of the emerging right-wing extremist politicians in the interwar period, and then, for a substantial sum, had the negatives enlarged. The first group of photographs published here were stored in an unsystematic miscellaneous box for decades, and they have never been catalogued. Photographs documenting the people's tribunals are somewhat more ordered, and they were correctly labeled as miscellaneous photographs of the people's tribunals. I have already referred to the selection aspect of the photographs. What factors determine whether a picture will be forgotten or become iconic? But a further aspect must be also noted, namely the issue of their mass availability. The photographs became widely available when they were published by such press outlets as the Life magazine, whose archive is now managed by the Getty Images. When the photographs belonging to the Getty Images became researchable online, the material relating to the Hungarian far-right movement immediately appeared on the far-right website, on the Whisperer, thereby creating a cycle in which the representations returns to the representational milieu. A special feature of this cycle is that the period between its 2 extremes is the era of both the Second World War and the Cold War, as well as the transition following the collapse of communism. Yet the pictures are uploaded to the site without any critical reflection, as if 70 years had never ever been passed. The provisionality of a photograph has got 2 dimensions: the survival of the photo and its internal provisionality. Photographs transform reality into something memorable. As soon as the exposure button on a camera is pressed, the present becomes past, frozen memory, and I'm arguing, a privileged representation. Therefore, the object of the photograph is lost. It is only present in the form of a memory. this past is an unfinished past which creates parallel pasts in the viewer. A regular visitor to this whisperer website and the historian myself will look differently at the very same picture. For both of them, the process of canonizational interpretation is underway, even if the interpretation occurs along opposing value axes. The question concerns the monopoly of interpretation. Who has the right to say what we should see in the photo? Thus returning to the main question, that of the divided memory of the war, we can state that the interpretation of the photographs has also contributed to the development of a divided memory. We were talking about the pillarization at the, before the talk. An important part of the Second World War history, the female perpetrators, became invisible in the collective memory owing to the absence of the visual representation. However, the special feature of the photographic genre mean that it is also offering an opportunity to go beyond this division. In this way, groups of alternative collective memories are established, which over time will strive for political representation. Susan Sontag claimed that, I'm quoting her, photographs of atrocity illustrate as well as corroborate, end quote. In the case of the photos about female perpetrators, it depends on who is looking at this type of photos while corroborating different claims. The process of viewing might silence some other photos, which is the same selection process as the one used in the case of selecting texts of traditional historical sources. The difference is that, as Sontag pointed out, and I'm quoting her, the problem is not that people remember through photographs, but they remember only the photograph, end quote. By remembering of certain photos, and I would like to go to this emblematic photo, people portrayed on the photo are to gain frozen, iconic visual status. So this photo, which will be on the cover of my book, which will be sold in 3,000 copies, I mean, this will have an iconic status. In the case of the two Auschwitz albums, now female guards enjoying their break also has become a part of the Holocaust imaginary, urging for rethinking the relationship between gender and Holocaust. In the case of Hungary, my research, searching for the visual representation for female perpetrators, might contribute to the process of further questioning the anti-fascist framework, which seems to be too high price for a feminist work to play. Thank you very much. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you for the interesting and thought-provoking talk. So I would like to open the floor to questions. I suppose that there are plenty of them. So after a little bit of processing.
Actually, I was thinking about what you have said about the transformation of memory through digital media, because this is something that it's also happening to us, in the sense that we have to come up with different technological tools to see what's going on, because it's overwhelming. For example, in our case, but I see it also in Hungary, and also how to interpret the new kinds of images, which I see that you have already developed. Because, for example, we in the Spanish process of exhumation in the last 10 years, in the middle of the century, the digital era came. So we started taking analogic, slides and pictures and whatnot, and suddenly everybody had smartphones, like almost overnight. And then the amount of material that was introduced increased, immensely. And also a lot of old images that were coming out of, from family records, family albums, would come out in the next measure, for example, and become public, rephotographed with digital media, and then sent to the webs in this kind of decontextualized fashion you are talking about. So I was wondering if you could, because it's very interesting for us, and maybe this is something that we can do with the cost action, because we're in the same working group. I think that this the transformation of these images becoming available through in your case through these right-wing web pages, which we also visit the right-wing web pages all the time. It's amazing because they rescue a lot of things, and we use these images and recycle them for our analysis, which is, I mean, it's exactly the same kind of reverse methodology you were talking about. But I don't know if you could elaborate a little bit more on the status of these images once they have, become available in a mass fashion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you very much for this question. I'm absolutely aware of the fact that this is not a Hungarian phenomenon, but I have to say that my research is very much localized, because in the Hungarian context you have to have 4 different books to have the professorship and 4 different degrees. And I'm running for the last one, the 4th one, and for that you have to produce a monograph which has a relevance for the Hungarian history, because you have got 8 committees evaluating that work. So that's just about the hierarchy of the institutionalization and knowledge production. So, I see that all over, I mean, I'm familiar with the European context, but all over you see that there is an influx and a change of how these different images have been stored, selected, and circulated. And I was arguing in this brief presentation that it's a very contentious combination when you have got all these factors coming together. Namely that suddenly you have a change in the interpretative framework. You have got a massive availability of pictures because the family archives are opening up, and because of the changing of the technology. And therefore all these photographs, which were previously hidden and they were kept in secret in the different family archives, suddenly they are becoming available, and together with the changing discourse, they are actually contributing to the revision of a previously existing historical consensus. And in Eastern Europe, this is the region I know the best, I mean, to be honest, the anti-communism very strongly related to a kind of criticism to the European left, and also that contributes to the opening up and the lenience for far-right thinking, and somehow the uncritical acceptance and the uncritical interpretation of the crimes committed during the Second World War. So that's a specificity of the Hungarian situation, that Hungary, as the last ally of the, as the slogan said, of the Nazi Germany, the Hungarian state collaborated and contributed and very leniently helped the Nazis to deport 460,000 Jews in 2 months. So this kind of, and after also before that and after that, there were several massacres which were committed against Hungarian citizens by the Hungarian state. So this type of process to somehow face what happened during the Second World War and to have a kind of critical reflection of what were the roots of this type of participation of Hungary in the Second World War has not happened because of several reasons. One of them is related to the communist memory politics, which was also a form of dominant memory politics. So what I would like to urge us as historians, professional historians, who have got a paper to prove that we are those who are, from a kind of guild reasons, expected to produce this type of narratives, is to somehow engage in this type of new history writing, because this is a type of public history. This is a form of public history. This is a form of constructing new a popularization of memory and constructing new spaces of memory production. And the internet, and these internet sites and also the Facebook sites, because there are several Facebook sites as well, I'm arguing they are important sites where this construction of memory is happening, like the sites of remembrance, to use this. And we can approach that from this angle. And then we have got a problem. Because we have a problem because all those terms like authenticity and the source criticism and all those classical positivist epistemological tools, what the historians are doing, using from Ranke and from the ancient Greece, they do not work, right? For example, of course I was searching these databases for atrocity photographs, right? And then I saw one photograph, and then which showed several Jews hurled by, who were wearing the David Star, hurled by uniformed arrow cross soldiers. And I said, yes, I found one, this is the document. And then I started to look more and more carefully, and then I recognized I've seen that picture before. And then I scanned my visual memory, and I recognized that this is actually a shot from one of the 1950s anti-fascist movies. So actually here you have an appropriation of any kind of image, because the interpretative framework is more important than the authenticity. So this is not an authentic photograph, but this is a picture taken from an anti-fascist movie in the 1950s, which is expected to demonstrate how horrible these Nazis were, the Hungarian Nazis, and it ended up at this website, browsed by the far-right activists and, of course, dedicated researchers like myself, and then they are considering it as an authentic photograph, which is a basis of their newly constructed identity, which is a positive identity. So what I want to say, concluding to your question, is that I see a very interesting collision of different type of factors, which are actually creating a methodological challenge, that all those previously existing methodological tools, what the historians were using, basically non-relevant anymore, and that creates a big gap. And this gap, you can very happily withdraw into the ivory tower and publish in peer-reviewed journals and, produce books which are read by 300 people. And then you have got these far-right websites which are visited by tens of thousands of people. And those Facebook pages are liked by tens of thousands of people. So the question is it a political question, it's an intellectual question, it's a professional question. And my closing sentence for answering to your question is that I believe that this is an intellectual responsibility of Europe today to somehow think critically about this challenge and somehow try to get engaged in a dialogue. And of course you can say that I'm naive because this dialogue will not happen, but I have got some positive stories as well, but I would like to shut up because you might have some questions. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I think it's very interesting what you do about analyzing visual representation. I was wondering how patriarchal system use the visual representation.
What kind of system?
The patriarchal?
Patriarchal system.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I understand what you say, that it wants to hide women, so we are not in history, as Gerda Lerner says when she focuses on women history. But I also saw in the last years that this system can use women in pictures to show that women can also be involved in war. So in a way to legitimate the war system. And I remember a picture of the Minister of Defense here.
Right.
Yeah. And that was very, I don't know, impressed, because women are involved in peace fight everywhere, and that picture was like, okay, we can engage life and war, so I don't know. So war is not as bad as you can see. So well, I was wondering this: how can a patriarchal system how can we use that to legitimate war as well?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I have to say I'm very cautious using the term patriarchy as an explanatory framework. I would rather say that actually your question proves one of my main statements in this paper, that it really depends on who is looking at the picture. Because when I was looking at this picture, seeing this Spanish Minister of War, pregnant, parading in front of the military personnel, I had a very different reading. So your reading is that this is a normalization of militarism. My reading was that this is actually a subversion of militarism, because militarism is about death. And here you have got a woman who is pregnant. But I understand your argument, namely that her body was an essentialized female body which is carrying the kind of seed of a new life. So this is the politics of motherhood, what she was actually performing in front of the soldiers who were there. And it's especially important in the Spanish context of dictatorship that you have got a woman there. So let's go back to this issue of women and war, right? And then you have got different explanatory frameworks. And the first framework, what you actually presented here, namely that women can be used as normalization of military as they are represented as mothers, right? So they are what is, Cynthia Enloe calls the women and children, right? So when women and children should be protected, women and children first. So this type of logic is creating a certain gender regime. I would call it gender regime than patriarchy. So this is one interpretation. And there is another one which I find extremely interesting and very thought-provoking, and I don't know where I'm standing in this context, namely that you have got lots of, nowadays lots of women who are actually entering into the military. You have got lots of women soldiers. You have got now a high-ranking soldier who is leading certain war operations. So the question is if the entering of women into those hierarchies, is it an integration or is it changing the military norms? And you have got different types of feminist positions, and they're both claiming they are feminist. Some of them are saying that this is basically a kind of masquerade and nothing has been changing. Some others are actually claiming that this is actually changing the root of militarism. So if we want to connect these two, or at least two different wings of interpretation to the visual representation, I would like to argue that this absence of women as women in uniform, these women who were perpetrators, this is basically a result of the non-existing frame of integrating women even under what you call patriarchal context. So I started my paper saying that usually women of the right-wing movement, they are actually invisible. There were very few women who were actually wearing uniform and they were fighting. This is not like the Salo Republic when actually women were wearing trousers and they were trained and they were fighting in the Italian Civil War. If we go back to the only picture I found about these women, they were wearing skirts, right? So this was not meant to be fighters. They were not really integrated into the military. Those who were fighting and those who were actually responsible for killing Jews, they were paramilitary organizations. They were not there in the uniform. So let me summarize what I wanted to say. What I wanted to say that I sympathize with your point about patriarchy, but I would like to urge us to move one step forward and to think about the possibilities. So if we are looking at patriarchy as a fixed structure, there is no way to break out from it. But I would like to suggest this type of gendered framework, the women and children framework, and also the possibility how to somehow change from within, which sounds horrible and pretty simplistic, but on the other hand, that military is not the same if you have got women, female bodies in the military as it had been before. And this will be a very long process, and I understand your kind of impatience. I understand your criticism, but I would like to suggest to have a long-term perspective and to think about what are the potentials of kind of pacifist and deconstructivist work in this context.
I have a question. Thank you very much for your presentation. Well, which I have found interesting when I have studied the picture of victims of the Holocaust, of female victims, is how photographers used to use the frame of the pictures to represent the humanization in a gender way. In the sense that they used to show how gender was destroyed to dehumanize victims. And of course, the dehumanization process is different in perpetrators, but I think they were also affected by this process. Do you think we can find a similar will behind the pictures of female perpetrators?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. If this dehumanization, I have got, how should I say? I have a problem with this dehumanization framework as far as the Holocaust victims are concerned. But let's go for the female perpetrators. So. If you look at the different photographs which I digged out from the archive as about the female perpetrators, for example, if you look at this picture, right, she is the wife of Sala. She was the head of the who used to be the head of the Hungarian state, and whose love life very much followed the pattern of Hitler. So they married only. A week before Sala was extradited to Hungary. So if you look at this photograph, you need the story to know what is behind that photo. Although this had been taken in an extremely humiliating circumstances. The head of the secret police was basically photographing everybody from this who were a part of this process of the justice system. But this process of documenting what has happened is basically stopped with the important women, the wife of the perpetrators. Otherwise, I have found only these types of photographs, these snapshots. So this is not about dehumanization, and that also goes back to the original question: what do you do with the different types of photographs? So obviously, these photographs, which were happenstances, and you don't know who made them, but somehow it found its way to the archive of the police. You need to have a very different type of methodological and theoretical approach to this type of photographs than those photos which are obviously kind of made photos for documenting this woman. The gaze is always connected with power. So when you are looking at this picture, you are obviously, if you are following the Susan Sontag argument, you are perpetuating the same type of violence which had been already committed against these women. But here you have got this very important distinction that these women were actually female war criminals, right? So these were not the victims of the Holocaust. So can you really compare these type of victim groups? And when you are saying you are comparing them, you are immediately, questioning the whole anti-fascist consensus of the post-45. And that raises a lot of methodological issues. because sympathy immediately comes in, and especially if you look at the execution of this woman, you see that this is a fragile woman. She really looks like, you know, the grandmother of any of ours, and because you don't know who she was, what did she do, why she was convicted, then you immediately feel sorry. And when you feel sorry, through your emotions, you are actually making those victims invisible. So that's why I find this comparison a little bit problematic, on that if you are looking at this, these photographs, of course they work through emotions, through constructions of emotions. And you were told to feel sorry for this type of photographs through these Christian images, because this is a martyrdom image. So then it goes back, and then we are going to the anthropology and visual anthropology, because you learn how to construct your image, your emotions through images from childhood onwards, and that's an important line. I don't want to go in. We don't have time to follow that. But what I wanted to say that I would like to just state that when you are working on the visual representation of female victims of the Holocaust, you can immediately, the dehumanization comes as a handy framework. But I just would like to suggest that there might be some other frameworks, namely the dehumanization was the intention of the Nazi regime as well. So when this dehumanization is used as a method of interpretation and an explanatory framework, then basically the victims are muted twice.
Okay. I have a couple of questions, but first thing I have to say is that I am not familiar at all with mythology or even with feminist theories. So
there are several people out there who are Christians. Yeah.
So I'm a little bit lost. And to show how lost I am, I'm going to say something about this debate about the Stalin's foreign ministry returning going to Afghanistan. That for me was probably the clearest expression of socioeconomic theories rather than
socioeconomic. I'm sorry, I have a problem with my hearing.
Because this show, and also related to another very known event, was an interview that she gave to a big journal in which she explained how she could interrupt a meeting of the chief of staff to breastfeeding her kid. My idea, she could interrupt a meeting of the chief of staff of the Spanish army just to walk upstairs and to breastfeed her kid. Okay. And you can read that in a communist way. I read it as a kind of very classic attitude, because, as we know, any Spanish woman can afford this kind of behavior. You know, go to Afghanistan with a military plane that's specifically prepared for you, and also go upstairs and interrupt a meeting, a working meeting, just to breastfeed your kid. And I'm not suggesting that it's a bad habit, but I'm saying is that you do that because you have a specific socioeconomic position, which being part of the government shows a little bit the kind of discourse behind that. So that's my reading of this kind of thing that perhaps clashes very much with feminist theory. But then my question is, to what extent these visual representations match what you call the role as perpetrators of women? Because you didn't say much about that in your presentation, probably because your whole interview is about visual representation. I'm curious about what was the role of perpetrators as perpetrated women. You suggested certain responses and part of the presentation that were invisible as perpetrators because they were not taking. They were participating in significant numbers, but they have a very important role. So to what extent there is a match between visual representation and the real role as perpetrators? You mentioned there were 7 women executed, and that represents really a significant number of on the whole size of perpetrators that were executed in Hungary. And then about the interpreting frame that you were using, I'm a little bit confused. Looking at this picture and another one in which the title was Ordinary Citizens, was 3 different pictures. To what extent there is really a, if I'm just using that because I'm not totally sure, to what extent there is a kind of suggestion of feelings associated with humanity, pity? I don't know what you're suggesting exactly that, because those kind of pictures remember very much the kind of pictures you can see in the judgment of the trial of Eichmann in Israel. And you see the picture when he's sitting in his jail, he doesn't look really as an able person, which was the point, and very much in the writing of Hannah Arendt. But you can see is that precisely banality is the essence of evil, and to a certain extent, perhaps not this picture, but the other ones, which was showing these people sitting as ordinary. This one, there is nothing evil on these women. So, but nevertheless, there is a match with the kind of representation you have in the case of Eichmann, which is totally associated with evil. So I don't see whether there is this gap in the way this representation is related to gender or not. Perhaps I am totally misunderstanding what you're trying to say, but I don't see the difference. I see that this is a kind of a normal way to perceive or to present evil in a certain cultural setting, rather than this interpretation.
Thank you. That's a very interesting point, because I think you are pointing out that how visual documentation is a form of normalization. And that, I have to say that, that might sound pretentious, but I basically don't buy the argument of Hannah Arendt about Eichmann, I have to say. And then this new film, I don't know if you have seen the new film about the Trotta film about Eichmann, and that is not an accident that now a German film is about Hannah Arendt, again constructing the myth of this ordinary citizen and Eichmann as the ordinary and of the banality of the evil. So what I wanted to say is that, of course, how would you do it differently? Right? Because you don't have the atrocity photos. Because they were not documenting. I haven't found the music box. That's why I was struggling with the technology to show you the music box. So there is no music box with the photographs, right? So what you have is the genre of the photographs taken in the court. And this framing influences how you are actually looking at and how they are looked at. And that was my claim, that basically this is influencing the way how you are looking at the perpetrators. So not only the missing pictures are important, but the reason why how these women are actually portrayed.
But do you think there's a difference in the way that women are portrayed and the male are portrayed when they are, for instance, sitting in courts?
No, because that's a ritualized performance. But what I wanted to say, my argument was focusing on the female perpetrators. And your question is a very legitimate question that I haven't given you the background, the so-called solid social history background, what these women did. So let me spend some minutes explaining to you that I was looking through hundreds of files of the People's Court to find and to reconstruct what kind of crimes these women committed. So they were secretaries, why they were condemned as war criminals. They were wives, they were secretaries, they were actresses, they were intellectuals, ideologists who were providing the Hungarian Nazi party with different kind of intellectual munition, and they were the so-called ordinary criminals. But they were not ordinary as Eichmann was ordinary, but ordinary as in a case of a very everyday way. Let me give you an example. So those women who were executed, and I don't know if I'm sure that she is not one of them, they were mostly the housekeepers who were denouncing the Jews hiding in the houses, who were actually with weapons, they were guarding and hurling the Jews to the bank of the Danube, and they were shooting them into the bank of the Danube. So into the Danube. So there were lots of different violent crimes, denunciations, killings, which were committed by these women. So that's why when I'm saying female perpetrator, that's from a social history point of view, it's a very wide range. What I wanted to do in this presentation is to show you how this visual representation, the lack of visual representation, is basically a kind of intellectual and political challenge for a feminist historian like myself, because when I'm writing about this, it is actually creating a space, and I'm bringing in these photographs into the mainstream visual narrative. So when my book will be published, and this will be on the cover, I mean, I have the responsibility of creating a visual discourse about female perpetrators. And I find this very horribly and very problematic from a theoretical point of view, from political point of view, and from intellectual point of view. Let me give you an example. In 1999, I wrote an article about the rapes committed by the Red Army soldiers. I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with the East. When the Red Army came, there were massive rapes in Hungary. And I wrote an article about these rapes, and I gave an estimate that, for example, in Budapest, approximately 50,000 and 200,000 rapes were committed by the Red Army soldiers. Of course, we know this magic number of 1 million rapes committed for 5 days in Berlin when the Red Army occupied Berlin. And this was published in Hungarian, in German, and in English. And in 2001, during the conservative government, they started to re-evaluate the history of the Hungarian the liberation of Hungary, and they used very often my article. I became the most often quoted feminist historian and the historian of the Zeitgeschichte during this discourse, because I proved that this has happened. And my research found its way to the far-right web pages. So if you go to the far-right web pages and about the suffering of Hungary during the Soviet occupation, my article is one of the important, listed as one of the first links if you are reading that particular web page. And because this is available on the internet. So if it had been published in one of the obscure specific journals for historians, nobody would ever have found it and would have used it. But since it was online, this has been used, and very often used by far-right and conservative politicians in order to prove that even Andrea Peto proved that this was such an important event. But they are talking about my research, which was a feminist research, pointing out that there is no way that you can actually count how many rapes have committed, and you have to understand it as a form of manifestation of male power and the reassurance of the victory of the Red Army, but they are basically interpreting it in a different ethno-nationalist framework. So going back to your question, of course, these are ordinary citizens, and you are seeing these pictures as you don't really see the difference. But when you or myself looking at these pictures and how these pictures have a history, and when my book will be published about this, they will have a totally different life out there. So going back to your original question, so this is also a responsibility of the researcher. What kind of topic are you choosing, and how you are writing about it, and what will be the afterlife of your research? So these ordinary citizens, I mean, it will have an impact, and I hope this will be the case, that Hungary will start thinking about the massive participation of Hungarians in the persecution of the Jews, and not the high political figures, not the important male figures who are politicians, and but you are thinking about the everyday intimate forms of execution. So your point that you don't see the difference as far as the framework of the court is concerned is a very legitimate point, but there is a difference. That this is the only picture which remained, and there are tons of pictures which remained about important male politicians being heard and persecuted in the yeah.
But hence my second question about what was the role as perpetrators, because you illustrated the perpetrator category in a very loose way, which you mentioned.
Yeah.
In your response to me, you mentioned you include that even wives, which in any conception of crime, wives are not perpetrators, are not criminals.
You are right, but unfortunately, the law on which they were persecuting the war criminals, there was one sentence saying that that was a compliance with the aim of the Arrow-Cross state, and the wives were compliances. So the term war criminal was basically defined in a very wide range. Therefore, they are wives, they are killers, they are murderers. So that's why this whole process, the lustration process after the Second World War, basically only in Budapest, which had got 1 million inhabitants, meant approximately 200,000 people. So nearly every person had got somebody who had been castrated. And this is another issue which hadn't been discussed, that there was a massive participation and a massive lustration process. So going back to the issue of who is a perpetrator, of course, if you are asking the far-right people, nobody is a perpetrator because that was a retroactive justice, and anyway it's good to kill communists, right? And they were fighting against the Red Army. And you know, they will not tell you openly, but they might not consider the extermination of Jews as bad as one might think. So then they are basically questioning the basis of the whole legal system, which was set up after 1945, and the legal system which was established to make into practice and to give a space for a new value system. And here, that's what I was arguing with this picture, that when you are looking at this picture of this executed female war criminal, when you are looking at this picture, you are not thinking about the crimes which she committed, but you are thinking about this poor woman whose cardigan was basically put in this way or that way. So basically, the visual representation and the documentation is undermining the whole legal process, which had been constructed in order to create a new anti-fascist norm.
But I don't know whether you subscribe to this specific narrative or not, but I don't know what's your position about that. But the question
is it a secret that I'm not a far-right person? Or
No. I don't mean that. I don't mean that.
You're quoted, but
I don't mean that.
Yeah.
It's not necessary to put it that way. What I mean is whether you subscribe the following fact is that questioning these images is very much associated with what I understand, which is a process of transitional justice, which is slightly, not totally, but slightly biased, because if you declare as perpetrator anyone who is associated or related to real perpetrators, to real criminals, basically you make whole society perpetrators at large. So in that respect, if you made a whole society at large, it's very difficult that you don't, you need to rescue, you rescue some elements of humanity, pity, and these kind of things just to do with that, because you are not sure whether you are really witnessing perpetrators in a hard understanding of that, people who really were criminals, or you were just looking at people who were associated somehow. Basically, you can say that the whole society or a big part of the society was associated with that. No problem with that. But
I understand that, a very good point. And this is actually a major methodological problem, because I think that now, myself as a historian, I cannot judge and cannot make any normative claims about that process, which happened between 45 and 49. I have to accept what has happened and look at the sources which were produced in that particular process, and try to think, what do we know from that process based on that documents, and what are the implications, how do we look at those documents nowadays. So that is my methodological position. And what you were actually saying is, how shall I say, is a very legitimate point, it's a humanist point. On the other hand, it opens up a very dangerous gate. It opens up a door to question the whole lustration process as a legal process, and through that even questioning the crimes which had been committed during the Second World War. I'm not saying that you question that.
There's a difference between criminal law and lustration. So I am not questioning
criminal law?
Lustration. I'm not questioning lustration, I'm questioning criminal law. What we are witnessing here is criminal law, so lustration. This is not lustration. Months is not lustration, it's criminal law. With the strongest penalty possible, which is the penalty. So we are not talking about lustration. Lustration can apply in a different way, and it's a different topic. I'm not questioning that. I'm questioning that applying criminal law to a category of perpetrators which is loosely defined immediately automatically triggers elements of humanity that are not apparently associated with the idea of punishment. That's one question. But everything depends on how sophisticated is the definition of perpetrators. If you restrict perpetrators, those who committed really crimes, killing people, for instance, just an example, I'm not saying that it should be the case, but you define it that way is much narrower, hence the category of people there would be narrower, and hence the kind of perception you can associate with the visual representation of those people perhaps would be narrower. I'm saying perhaps, I'm not totally convinced, it will be narrow. But if you enlarge the category of perpetrators, then the scope of sentiments, of feelings associated with that will be also broader. You make the whole society feel guilt, it will be very difficult that you don't rescue any kind of feeling of emotion that is positive.
Very good point. I'm using the Begriffsgeschichte approach, and I'm using the definition of perpetrator which had been used by this legal system after 45. You can say that's a problematic approach, but we don't have a better than that. Can you, because what I think is we have to evaluate that process based on who were the participants, what kind of legal processes were there, whom did they define as a perpetrator, and we will never know who were the real perpetrators, and we will never know all the crimes. And this is a universalistic approach. So we will know what they found important, and I think that now as historians what we can do is look and to understand what and analyze what did they consider as perpetrator and how.
Yes, but then don't you think, I mean, is that a question, do you think that the interpretation of the kind of frames associated with this specific picture should be asked in the 40s rather than now? Because this picture has been taken in the 40s, not now. So you will accept also, if you follow the same logic, that your ability to capture the interpretation associated with this picture nowadays does not include the elements that were intended and probably captured in the 40s. You know what I mean?
That's true. That's why I was using Bart because he is saying that the picture itself doesn't have a meaning. The picture is always, it depends on who is looking at what kind of context. And I don't think it's an accident that this picture has never been published. It was me who did this up with a feminist intention to show what was the role of women in the whole Second World War process, and how I can actually find this is through these documents which are available and through the photographs which are available. So the historian is always looking at, I mean, not the past but the future, and I want to explain what is the present kind of reception of this kind of stories. Yeah.
I have a different question.
Yeah. Okay.
I was wondering when you were talking about opening up of the family archives, and that through that, so those are not these pictures from the courts, but more these family pictures. If those are family archives that were already stored in national archives, and that these archives became available after a certain amount of years of restriction, or if they are photos who are uploaded maybe by right-wing people and who upload photos from their own family albums. So where, or it may be a combination of both, and what do you do with the origin of these?
I wish I would know the origin of these photos. I have to say that I did all possible tricks to get to know who are the owners of these photographs.
Because you get them only through the Whisperers.
Yeah, I only get it through the Whisperer, and then you have to get into the Whisperer you have to get registered. And I registered in my own name, and I also registered because it's known, and I also registered, that's kind of ethically not that acceptable, but also as under a pen name. And I did try for both emails to try to get in contact with the person who is the administrator of this webpage to get to know the origin of these photographs, and I never received an answer. So I mean, that's a kind of problem that I never got an answer. What is the origin of these photographs, except what is the capitation? Right? And the title of these photographs, and that said a family picture from Košice, which is now Slovakia, and then the Arrow Cross, of course, was very active in the mobilizing the Hungarians who got outside of the Hungarian territory after the First World War. So I found these photographs in the police archive, the National Archive, and also on this particular website which collects the family archives, and I'm sure that these people uploaded these photos with a certain service to the community, and that's why I was talking about how the visual representation at a certain point is constructing a political representation. And I strongly connect this kind of overflow of images with the strengthening of the far-right movement in Hungary.
Yeah, because then, well, my second question is this, that you hinted at how to enter as a critical historian, how to enter in a debate with a website like The Whisperer. So, I mean, it's about a little bit about communication strategies from academics. And then related to that, I was all the time when you said this picture is going to be on the front of my book. Then I thought, okay, your book is going to be on the internet. So this picture, when we Google you, we're going to have the picture of your book. So what is going to be the title of your book? Because then right away the picture is going to be related to the title that will be imprinted.
Invisible Perpetrators. I think that's the title. Yeah, but that's a serious problem. Yeah. So
but you don't have any strategies of how to...
I have to say, I did try with the, in the case of the rapes committed by the Red Army soldiers, I had a strategy. I had a strategy that when I was interviewed by the conservative press or far-right press, I always gave an interview. I haven't declined any interviews, but I always insisted on, I want to see before publication what the text. And I also gave an interview to this new film, what they are making about the rapes committed by the Red Army soldiers by a female filmmaker, because I wanted to have my views represented. So if there is a space, I would like to be present, but I would like to somehow keep the control of where I am present. But this really requires a reconsideration what kind of intellectual strategies you are using when getting involved in public debate. Let me give you an example. There is the Wergeland Center in Oslo, which is pioneering in anti-racist education, multicultural education, human rights education. And they asked me to write a position paper about gender and far right. So I wrote that paper, Gender and Far Right, and they were scheduling a webinar to discuss that. I mean, that's their procedure, to have a statement and then a webinar when all the people who are registered in that center take part. And this happened last week when this webinar was scheduled, and the web page was attacked. So it was jammed and it was attacked, so the webinar after 10 minutes was closing down because the website was attacked. So, and then you can say that I'm a naive person when I thought that there will be a discussion. And what was interesting that in Oslo, the center, they were totally surprised that this has happened. And I thought, they are more prepared for kind of the jamming of the website. And it turned out they were not, and that was the first time when their webinar was attacked. So then you can say that, how can you make a dialogue? How can you make a communication when you want to communicate with people and some are actually attacking the website? So this is really the question for the future, and I have to say, looking around in Europe with different political developments and also what's happening in Turkey, there are positive signs, and I think we should look at the positive side and simply try. And this might sound as an empty hope, but that's the only thing we have at the moment, I think.
I guess I first just have a brief comment and then a question. The comment, I guess, is that I think what's very interesting about what you're doing is in some way contributing to theorizing absence. There's been a lot of work on absence and memory and the absence of photographs, the absence of images. But this is a different, you're talking about a different kind of absence and different kinds of people that are absent in the historical record. So just a comment that I think can be a very theoretically engaging project. So I'm excited about your book. But also my question would be, have you, or are you interested in trying to also use kind of oral history or interviews in relation to photographs? So trying to, in addition to contextualizing them within the archive, but also either from, you know, firsthand witnesses, or kind of recuperating the oral histories linked to these images. I'm just interested in that, not just what's written or inscribed, but what can be, I don't know, recuperate, what kind of evidence can be recuperated through oral history?
Thank you. I think that's a very good question. But I have to say that that I was writing this book about female perpetrators. The book is centered around one particular massacre, which happened on the 15th of October 1944 in Budapest. And I was lucky enough to interview the survivors. That was a normal apartment house where you don't know how many people, 200, 300 Jews were crammed together because of the policies. And then 18 people were killed on that particular night. And from that 200, 300 people, I managed to find some of the survivors who were deported but returned. And I also managed to interview the family of the perpetrators. So, I mean, that's a very different research. But how to say, as a spin-off project, I was looking for the visual representations if there is at all available anything, because that massacre was done by a woman. So, I mean, she was the person who led the paramilitary group into that house, and it still confirms this old common sense that you can be a good historian if you've got good sources. And here, there are certain points when you have to admit that there are no sources, right? So it was practically impossible to follow up those female perpetrators who were convicted as perpetrators, and you are legitimately, you can say that you don't know if they were really perpetrators, but they are labeled as perpetrators. But I only focused on that particular case. So, because that's a kind of haystack, so I mean, finding a needle in the haystack.
And are any of the photographers themselves, I mean, maybe they're not still living,
yes,
but that would be another interesting.
I wish these photographers, I would know who are they and if they were alive. But I cannot answer to any of these questions. So that's why the absence and the non-identification becomes a historical fact. Because you have got a huge amount of sources without any contextual data. What would make you a normal mainstream historian?
And then just one last, it's more of a comment. I don't know if you know any of Elizabeth Edwards' work on photography and history, and she's trained as, maybe as an anthropologist. She's worked kind of bridging anthropology and history. But I think some of her approaches to trying to deal with these absences, both in archives or in family collections, is really interesting.
I know, what's her name?
Elizabeth Edwards. I can give you more.
Okay. See, I don't think I used her work. So, yeah, thank you.
I have a question on the speed. Isn't it also important in terms of the kind of photoeliciting you are trying to do, sophisticated methodology, to compare, images, the visibility of perpetrators with the visibility or invisibility of victims, of female victims? I don't know if you have a corpus of photographies about female victims, which in a sense can be used as a contrast in iconographic terms, or with also in terms of how they were portrayed in the 40s, like whom or whatnot. So probably that give another twist to make it more. Maybe even when the category of victim can be as complicated as the one of perpetrator, but just as a general pattern. No? And then I was trying to, through your talk, I was thinking all the time about the Spanish case, and it's radically different because in terms of victims and perpetrators, because what happens is that I can't imagine. I mean, I've been scanning, so images from the Civil War, particularly what we now understand, are perpetrators or the Civil War winners, and I don't see a woman anywhere. And I don't know if
You mean in visual representations?
Excuse me?
You mean in
visual representations.
there are pictures of the sección femenina.
But that's after the war, you know.
Yeah.
And I was going to talk about the sección femenina, but what happens is, for example, you have images of milicianas,
Yeah.
which is like a whole category of,
Yeah.
of heroism, which has historical roots in Agustín de Aragón. I don't know, you can trace it back all the way, but I don't see an image of Franco with a sea general, just discussing, military strategy in the field. I mean, probably somebody has to look for that. But we do have images of perpetrators of the time on the one hand, which is basically women who were sympathetic to the Republican ideals, whose families were killed, and they were humiliated publicly, in the squares, in their villages, particularly they had a haircut, they would be driven around naked or riding donkeys, very, connected to the Inquisition kind of Inquisitorial practices, and they were perpetrators at the time, I don't know, but now they are totally understood as victims, whereas the victims of the time were, the sección femenina and particularly these women who fought so hard, and they were trying to rescue, women from, the aftermath of war.
That's also the essence of my question about embarking category perpetrators, because if you look at it from a contemporary point of view, it would be very difficult to hold accountable people who were passively involved in a modern criminal law. It would be totally impossible to think that someone, because he's the partner or the wife or just sympathetic to a particular idea, would be held to be perpetrator. That would be very difficult. And it seems that you have an argument that this has happened in the Hungarian case, whether there is a revision of the way in which perpetrators were defined after the war, which is a common problem for Europe, because there was a strong emphasis from the Soviets in the way that they were. May I add something about this comparative image? But I think it would be interesting to have a comparative, but across country view. Are visual representations equal in other countries? Do they have the same systems? I was thinking in your presentation, you mentioned very much the music box, but I was thinking another movie which is more recent, The Reader, in which there is the portrait of a perpetrator, female, but in my understanding it's a very precise portrait, because it's the head of the guardians of concentration camp, the female guardians. So it's very narrowly defined. And then the reaction, of course you can tell me that the movie is a totally different media instrument, so probably it doesn't have the same value, but the reaction of the public in the court is totally different. It's much more critical and engaging, and the public, they hate her. So it's a different way, but of course it's a movie, we're not talking about the picture. But what I am trying to say is that perhaps it makes sense to compare the different experiences in different countries, but probably the same period of time, whether there would be some kind of variance in the way women perpetrators are presented in one case and the other. And I think in this case, the reader is what the definition of perpetrators in the western part of Europe. The notion of perpetrator was narrow, was always narrow, and much more individual. And that perhaps can explain reactions that are more concentrated on focus on specific individuals like these groups.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So, what I find a $1 million question is how to get beyond this victim-perpetrator battle. So, because it really doesn't help us to think further. So, in this work, what I was presenting, I was looking at the Begriffsgeschichte of a certain category, which is the perpetrator, and how it is actually used nowadays, or what are the political consequences of this lack of visual representation. But in the long run, I think we should move beyond this perpetrator-victim dichotomy, because this is always creating canon and the counter-canon. But it's a difficult question, especially in my field, because I'm working on the Holocaust, because at the moment you start thinking about this, you immediately blamed and criticized of being a relativist, because there are certain norms which should not be questioned. And it's very difficult and problematic to somehow solve this issue, to be kind of nuanced and moving beyond the perpetrator and victim dichotomy when you have got such normative framework. And it would be excellent to make a kind of comparative research, especially in this Central European context. But first, there is a language problem. I only speak German and Russian. And I don't speak the languages of the countries around me, which is in itself, it's a very, a product of the time. And also if you look at the specificity of the Hungarian participation of the Second World War, I think what is really relevant is comparing it with Austria, with Germany and Italy, because these are the countries which were really the Axis powers. So in a sense, Hungary was constantly a supporter. So therefore, no matter that I'm of course aware of Romania and Slovakia, the different fascist states, but what I wanted to say is that the way how these countries are actually handling their dark legacy, and I would rather go for the dark legacy concept. So how they are actually taking the dark legacy of their political system and their value system, that might be interesting for other countries as well. So, and that's why the Reader is a very good example, because that is actually based on a concrete trial, which happened in 1963, I see. And that trial is, on the one hand, strengthens that the guards, female guards of the concentration camp, they are portrayed as beasts, and they are accused as beasts. And then there are lots of other women who were compliant to the Nazi war machine, who never ever got to that position. And then let me go back to your very important critical point about the category of perpetrator. Because, for example, those women in the Nazi Germany who went to the East as teachers, doctors. Elizabeth Harvey wrote a very interesting book about those women who were supporting the Nazi war machine as normal professionals. And they never got to the court because they never did anything which would have been identified as a war crime. On the other hand, their intellectual contribution to maintain and to expand Nazi Germany, actually crucial. On the other hand, and that is her argument, that was the space where they could actually exercise their agency, because the Nazi Germany was very much a Kinderküche, what is the third one? So this kind of very conservative gender regime, and the way out to exercise a kind of independent, autonomous female agency was out there in the East. So it's a very complex, difficult situation, and that's why when I was using this term ordinary, I was not using as the banality of the evil, but as an everyday person. Yeah?
That can be very repetitive. In this comparison, I'm sorry to come to this point, you take Austria, Italy and Germany, you're taking countries that use after the war Western criminal justice systems, whilst Hungary didn't. You use a Soviet...
What kind of system?
Western criminal justice system. Whilst in Hungary you use a more Soviet model, which were much more collective and thinking in the collective responsibility that was able to bring everyone as participants. So that's a very important and crucial difference that I think shouldn't be neglected.
I have to disagree with you.
Okay.
And I spent years to prove this, that between 45 and 46, this is 1 year, but in that period, basically what they were using is there is not such difference between the legal systems as later on, after 49, it was there. So this period between 45 and 49 is a kind of black hole, because it's easy from now, 2013, say that this was the case and generalize the legal system which was in place after 45 to that particular period. But between 45 and 49 there were lots of different legal systems which were merging together, and in 49 the Sovietization of the legal system started. And that is what informs our present understanding. But in 45, they were basically using the already existing Hungarian legal system to persecute those who were actually committing those crimes. And then later, that's another process. That's a very interesting history of law to look at how it actually later on happened. So, and also think about East Germany, right? So, I mean, the German case is interesting, and there is this book by Bloxham who actually compares the East German and the West German side. And then you see that East Germany was much, lenient and stronger to persecute, because that was needed to construct West Germany as the country which is the follow-up state, or the or what is that, what's the word, which is following the legacy of Nazi Germany. So that's a very different story. So what I wanted to say is that here are several, I mean, for this very short period between 45 and 49, there are different aspirations and fantasies which are actually acted out between 45 and 49. Even there was a short period when they were doing the first survey of collecting who saw what, who participated in what. So there were actually two types of legal systems at the same time. One is this attempt to Sovietize the Hungarian legal system, but there was also a kind of democratic attempt, and they were going out and giving out surveys saying that please fill in this form and return the form to the persecution office because we are doing a public lustration. Of course, that was immediately stopped by the Communist Party, because what they needed is the Sovietization of the legal system. But at the moment you are forgetting about this democratic system, you are again strengthening the way how the communists were transforming the country. So I think it's a very subtle and very sophisticated analysis is needed, and we should not be informed by our present understanding, because that's also a product of what has been done before.
Okay.
Thank you. That was a good conclusion. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I don't know if you enjoyed it. I enjoyed it enormously. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.